This is going to be your introduction into a foundation of watercolor knowledge. So this is just going to be what the material is, some basic terminology, and some information on how to use it. A few terms that we're going to be going over and just general techniques that you're going to be learning are, first term is watercolor cakes. That's just what you call what's in the palette. Opacity is the level of transparency, so how vibrant or how clear a color may appear. A flat wash, which is using a wider brush to fill a larger area of space. Glazing, which is layering on top of existing pigment or existing watercolor, and blotting, which is using paper towels and other absorbent material to remove pigment that's already on the page. So remove paint that's already on the page. Before you learn about that, though, you do need to learn about paintbrushes. So the paintbrushes that you're using, they are very specific. They are very expensive. A paintbrush is more expensive than you would think. For one of the fancier ones is probably like $5 to $8 for a paintbrush, not just like one or two that you would expect. So the anatomy of a paintbrush is the image that's on the left. So you have the tip of the paintbrush, it's the very top point. The belly is the bottom. All of that is the head of the paintbrush, or otherwise referenced as the bristles of a paintbrush, the hair of a paintbrush. That's all that top part. The part that holds the head of the paintbrush to the actual brush part that you hold is called a ferrule. I think that's how you say it. But that's that metal part that clamps the two together. You have the crimp that holds that top part to the actual like wooden piece of the paintbrush, and the handle, which is the part that you hold on to. Also on the paintbrushes, you'll notice that some of them have numbers on it. It could be a 2, it could be a 6. That determines the size of a paintbrush. The higher the number, the bigger the paintbrush is. So that's the anatomy of a paintbrush. Going over a little bit of the care. I do want you to treat these with kindness and respect. So don't damage any bristles. Don't smash it on the surface. Just be very gentle with these paintbrushes. Don't use boiling hot water. Use lukewarm water. You're just going to be using watercolor, so make sure that you wash off the brush really well when you're done using it. Don't let the paint dry on there. And one thing with watercolor is I don't want you to be leaving your paintbrushes in the paint cup. That causes the bristles to get damaged. And then one thing that you can do when you're all done using a paintbrush for the day is you can take your fingers and kind of repoint the head or the bristles of the paintbrush, just to reshape them and store them well. There are a few different types of paintbrushes that you will see, maybe not in this class, but in others that you may take. So just going through them, they're the angled brush. It has an angle to it. A wash brush, I mentioned wash before, but it's a thicker brush that you can just use to make a clear space, fill a white space on your paper. A fan brush looks like a fan. A round brush, they're the ones that you more commonly see and probably the ones that you have in front of you, where the belly or like the top of the ferrule of the paintbrush is round. You have a filbert brush, which has more of a rounded top to it. A liner brush, which is a very, very tiny amount of bristles. They're used for very, very tiny details. And then a bright brush, which I think is just a smaller version of a wash brush. So now going on to some more terminology. So watercolor cakes. Watercolor cakes are the colored area of a watercolor palette. So this is the part that you'll use to paint from. This is the actual paint itself. So to activate the watercolor cake, you add water by using a paintbrush, or some of you who are maybe more advanced or doing this on your own can spray the entire palette with water with a spray bottle. We aren't going to be doing that. You're just going to be using it, activating it using a paintbrush. So with watercolor, when you're using watercolor cakes, the more color that you use, the lighter the color will appear and the more transparent it will appear. The less water you use, the darker the color will appear. So more water, less color, less water, more color. You need to make sure that you're using enough water so that it's not streaky on the page. If your paint is streaky, that means that you have a lot of pigment on there and not a whole lot of water. When you see that, or if that happens on your page, you can always just add more water instead of going back and adding more paint. Next is opacity and transparency. Opacity and transparency. Opacity describes the transparency of a color, so it determines if it's see-through or not. So you can see in the image the little colors on the top. They're a lot lighter. As you go down, you can see the color a little bit more. So transparency is just a thin layer that you can see through. If you reference something as having full opacity, it's a solid color. If it has low opacity, it's very transparent. Pigment. Pigment is what's found in all paints. So pigment is the foundation of all paints. It is the most basic form of a dried color substance that's mixed with a binder. So um, what you see in the image that is all dried pigment, you would mix it with a binder or a liquid that is going to determine the type of paint. Watercolor is held together by a water-soluble binder, which is why it's activated by water, while acrylic is bound by an acrylic polymer emulsion, which means you don't need anything to activate it. You can use it right out of the tube. If a paint is highly pigmented, it means that the color is bright and vibrant when it's applied. If a paint has low pigmentation, it's not clear and it looks transparent. So moving on to more of the technique stuff. So a flat wash is what you see in the picture. It is just a way to fill a large portion of the space uniformly. So you would use a wash brush to do this. That's why it's wider. You would use it to fill the whole space. If the paint is diluted too much, it would become opaque, so very transparent. A wash is a foundation that will fill a large space on the paper, um, or it can be used in the writing it mentions it's to paint a sky, for example, but it can also be something that can be layered upon. So when you layer colors on top of one another, that's called glazing. So you're going to be layering a wash over a wash, or this is something that you can do to create a layer of depth. The layered effect will create a deeper amount of color in your